So picture this. It's morning, you stagger into the kitchen and grab that little curved metal spoon. The kind that probably came free with a jar of instant coffee. You dip it into a bag of white crystals, tip it into your cup, give it a quick stir, and honestly, you don't even think about it again. The sugar dissolves before you've even finished stirring. Nothing about this everyday gesture feels like history, right? It just feels like a reflex. It's just background noise in an ordinary morning. But when your tongue lights up as that sweetness hits, you are actually running a biological program that is older than humanity itself. We're talking about an instinct older than primates as we'd recognize them today, and honestly older than the continent you are probably sitting on right now.
Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to dive deep into the evolutionary mismatch of sugar. We're going to unpack the completely fascinating ancient history behind our relentless sugar cravings. And by the end of this, we'll see exactly why that tiny spoonful of sugar in your morning coffee represents this massive head-on collision between our deep biological past and the modern environment we live in today. Let's get into it. Section 1. The ancient sweetness craving. To actually find the true origin of our sweet tooth, we have to zoom way, way back. Not just a few thousands of years, but more than 30 million years ago. We're heading to a place called the Fayum Depression in northern Egypt. Now back then, this wasn't a desert. It was a thick, incredibly wet woodland canopy. And somewhere up in those trees, our early primate ancestors, the creatures that would eventually give rise to monkeys, apes, and us humans, they faced a massive dietary choice every single day.
Imagine living in a wild world with absolutely no agriculture and zero guarantees of a meal tomorrow. These early primates basically had two main survival strategies. On one hand, they could forage for hard nuts and seeds. These are tough, they're durable, and they're protected by really thick shells. They definitely offer calories, but they demand some serious physical labor just to crack open. Or, on the other hand, they could hunt for soft, ripe fruit. Fruit basically hands over its sugary, energy-dense calories cheaply and almost instantly. But of course, that's only if you can actually find it in season before some other animal does. Now, whichever path these animals chose, it was going to leave a permanent mark on the hardest tissue in their bodies, their teeth.
Just 5%, that's a pretty crazy number. When dental anthropologist Ian Towell and his team examined over 400 fossilized teeth from different groups of these early primate ancestors, they were trying to figure out which dietary strategy actually won out over time. They were specifically looking for chips from biting into really hard things and cavities from eating soft, sugary things. And the results? Only 5% of those ancient teeth showed any chipping at all. It's an incredibly low number. Instead, the decay patterns pointed directly to a really heavy preference for soft, sugary fruit. And this preference, it wasn't just a fleeting habit. It was quite literally hardwired into us. The ability to detect and crave sweetness is carried by this specific gene called TS1R2. It's a sweetness detection gene that is present across the entire primate family tree. Animals that could detect sugar-dense food got a fast, totally reliable source of energy to survive. And, this completely flips that popular myth on its head, the one that says our ancestors were exclusively these tough, lean, meat-eating survivors. Soft, sugary fruit was actually our foundational, default energy choice millions of years before early hominins ever even picked up a spear.
Section 2. The era of scarcity. Let's fast forward a few million years. Early hominins in Africa and Europe suddenly found themselves hunting for an even more concentrated, incredibly fast-burning sugar source. But there was a major catch. This source was heavily guarded, and it was extremely dangerous. Which brings us to this absolutely remarkable cave painting in eastern Spain at a site called the Cuevas de la Araña. This dates back roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years. The painting shows a human figure suspended high up on a rope or vine ladder, reaching their arm deep into a crevice to rob a wild beehive. Just think about how utterly desperate you have to be to risk a deadly fall, not to mention thousands of violent stings from angry bees, all for a tiny payload of pure sugar in the form of honey.
Because for basically all of human history, sugar wasn't something you simply had. It was something you earned, and usually at a very real physical cost. It wasn't a daily snack just sitting in a nice bowl on your kitchen counter. Going after sugar was a highly calculated risk. It was an energy-dense prize that you earned maybe just a handful of times a year, and that's only if you were extremely lucky and highly skilled. The human body was quite literally built for this extreme scarcity. Section 3. From grass to crystals. Now, the story takes a dramatic turn thousands of kilometers away from that Spanish cave. Because eventually, humans stopped just risking their lives to find wild sugar in the woods, and they actually figured out how to grow it. Let's look at how this played out. Between 6 and 8,000 years ago, up in the highlands of New Guinea, people began domesticating a wild grass into what we now know today as sugarcane. At first, they just chewed it raw. But the real game changer happened over in India, potentially around the 5th century BCE. That's where they figured out how to boil the cane juice down into solid, storable crystals. They called this brand new substance shakara, which translates to grit or gravel. And fun fact, that's actually the root of the word sugar. From there, it became this exotic, heavily prized rarity traded just like a spice or a medicine. It made its way to southern China by 500 BCE, and later even prompted Chinese envoys in the 7th century CE to travel all the way to India specifically to learn these advanced refining methods.
Section 4. The Industrial Sugar Rupture. So even as farming spread across the globe, sugar remained incredibly rare and expensive. Now, you might have heard the popular story that early farming and grains are what actually ruined human teeth. And to be fair, while starchy grain-based diets did cause a modest increase in cavities, the true dietary disaster happened much, much later. Back in 2013, a geneticist named Christina Adler led this incredibly elegant study. Her team examined fossilized bacterial DNA that was literally trapped inside the calcified plaque of 34 skeletons. These skeletons span 7,500 years of European history, and what they found was just astonishing. After a very small shift when early agriculture first began, the human oral microbiome basically stayed remarkably stable for thousands of years. So farming alone definitely didn't cause the dramatic decline in our oral health.
The real villain here? The Industrial Revolution. Based on some eye-opening data documented by anthropologist Sidney Mintz, back in the year 1700, British per capita sugar consumption was about 4 pounds a year. Just 1 century later, in 1800, that number skyrocketed to 18 pounds a year. This fourfold explosion was driven by industrial mass manufacturing and, tragically, an economic system built entirely on forced and enslaved labor on vast Caribbean plantations. Almost overnight, sugar stopped being a rare, expensive spice and became this cheap, seemingly limitless commodity.
This right here is the true rupture in our evolutionary timeline. Think about it. The agricultural revolution, which unfolded slowly over 10,000 years, barely shifted our oral bacteria. But the industrial revolution, it altered absolutely everything in just 200 years. This sudden artificial abundance completely rewired our oral microbiomes, creating the cavity-causing dominant bacteria that we see in our mouths today. We basically took an ancient, deeply conserved craving, one we inherited across tens of millions of years of primate evolution, and we just handed it an unlimited, ultra-cheap, year-round supply. Section 5. The Modern Evolutionary Mismatch. And that brings us right into the present day. We are currently living in an era of totally unnatural industrialized abundance, but we are walking around in bodies that are still operating on millions of years of scarcity programming. Look, if you feel like your sugar cravings are completely bottomless, or if you constantly struggle with cavities, I want you to know it is not a moral failing. It is not some modern weakness in your character or a lack of willpower. Your body was quite literally built for a world where sweetness meant a lucky find of wild fruit or a terrifying climb of a cliffside to a guarded beehive. Almost everything about how sugar affects you today stems entirely from this massive biological mismatch. So we end up right back where we started this explainer, with that small, totally ordinary metal spoon. It doesn't ask you to climb a rope ladder. It doesn't ask you to wait for a fruiting season. It just asks you to reach for it. Next time you stir that sweetness into your morning cup, ask yourself, are you just feeding a modern habit, or are you answering a survival instinct that predates our very species by tens of millions of years? Thanks so much for learning with me today. I really hope this changes how you look at your morning routine forever.
NextGen Hustle. Like, share, subscribe.